Hi, everyone. In this lecture video, we're going to be talking about the first language acquisition theories that you read about for this week and some other key concepts that are important for you to know. So I want to begin by talking about some of the historical shifts that have occurred in our understanding of first language acquisition. So as you read about for this week, some of the earliest perspectives to inform the way that we think about how first languages are learned came from the behaviorist perspective, especially from the work of psychologist B.F. Skinner. So behaviorism is a theory that believes that language and learning, excuse me, happens through stimulus and response, through imitation. So when looking at language, the theory underlying language development is that children are imitating the languages they hear, and that is how they're developing language. So a behaviorist perspective on first language acquisition believes that as children imitate and practice language, they begin to learn patterns, and that is how they develop their first language. This perspective is very dominant throughout the 1940s and 1950s until we began to shift away towards more innatist perspectives. And some of the critiques that came up about behaviorist perspectives were that children would say things that adults never would. So when young children are learning to speak English, for example, they sometimes say words like bringed. So they don't use the irregular past tense, they apply the past tense rule that works for many verbs, adding ed to irregular words. So instead of saying brought, they would say something like bringed. And a behaviorist perspective should show that children would only reproduce the types of sounds that they're hearing, that they wouldn't be creating these incorrect forms of the language because that hasn't been part of their environment, right? Also, corrections are not very common. So even though parents will correct children sometimes, and other adults will correct children when they speak, children are not constantly being corrected, and yet they are eventually learning correct forms, right? So every time a child says bringed, there isn't someone coming in saying, no, it's brought. And yet they learn eventually that that's not the correct form of the word. So that led some to argue that there must be some kind of innate cognitive ability. So today, most people do not ascribe to the behaviorist perspective. From the behaviorist perspective, we move towards innatist perspectives. And there are still many people who do ascribe to this view of language. It was really developed and put forth by Noam Chomsky, who's a professor at MIT, who's still working there today. And he argued that humans are biologically programmed for language, that every human baby is born with the capacity to develop language, or what he called universal grammar, sometimes abbreviated as UG. So we have universal grammar in our minds, and that is what enables any baby born anywhere in the world barring any sort of serious cognitive disability, will be able to acquire language, right? And some of the ideas that were connected to this perspective are the poverty of the stimulus. So Chomsky argued that we can't explain all of the language that children are able to produce, even forms of words that they've never heard before, based on the stimulus alone. So remember, behaviorists were about stimulus and response, right? I'm getting input and then I'm producing language. And he was saying the stimulus doesn't give children everything they need. And yet we hear children applying rules to words that they don't know yet, right? And there was a great test that you read about called the WUG test. I also included some videos about the WUG test in today's materials that shows an example of that, right? Children can apply rules to words they don't even know once they've started to understand the way that their language works. Another theory that is often associated with Noam Chomsky and the innatist perspective is the critical period hypothesis, which is the argument that at a certain point, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to acquire a first language. And this was also kind of an argument Chomsky was making connected to this idea that there's something in our brains that are pre-wired to learn language. He argued that our brains had something called a language acquisition device, LAD. You see that in the image at the bottom of the screen. As our brains grow, when we're young, our brains are fairly malleable, but as we grow, and especially when we hit puberty, there's a process of lateralization where different abilities and skills start to become localized to certain regions of the brain. And so he argued that there was a certain period after which time, if someone did not acquire language, they wouldn't be able to, because the brain had kind of formed where it was going to form. And it's very difficult then to acquire language. There's been a lot of debate about that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, especially as it relates to second language acquisition in this course later on in future weeks. But essentially, some of the studies that have been used to show it are studies that you read about, like Jeannie, who was a girl who was essentially kept from learning language until much later in her life. She was abused by her family, and she was kept isolated from all people until she was about 12 or 13 when she was discovered. And it was very difficult for her to learn any language, even into adulthood, which is one example that's sometimes held up as an example of the critical period hypothesis. However, others have argued, there's so many other factors involved there, the trauma of being abused like that for so many years. So it's difficult to know with examples like that if there truly is a period after which time we can't acquire a first language. But there have been some studies that have attempted to define what this might be. So one concept, and again, we'll come back to this again when we think about second language acquisition, is there a period after which time it is impossible or very difficult to acquire a second language? So we'll look at that question later. So the innatist perspective has continued to be very, very popular and very influential today. And there are, like I said, many people who ascribe to it. However, there are some critiques of this perspective, such as the critique that the environment also plays a very important role. The innatist is really focused on what's happening in the mind. And so it doesn't put as much attention to everything happening around the person learning the language. And that there's a lot of emphasis on this final state, kind of arriving at this adult-like native proficiency, and not as much attention to the process, which is really what's important to know when we think about language acquisition, first language acquisition. So perspectives that have developed since then and have continue to be influential and widely taken up today are the interactionists and the developmental perspectives. Again, these have been developed by many people, but are often attributed to John Piaget and Lev Vygotsky, two psychologists working in very different contexts and with different ideas of how language and learning happen, but both very much connected to understanding the environment and thinking about that language acquisition is also connected to, influenced by, similar to how we acquire other knowledge and skills. So Piaget really closely connected this link between cognitive development and language, and made the connection that, some of our language development requires us to understand a concept. So to understand the words bigger and more, we have to understand the concepts of something being compared to something else, right? Otherwise, we can't acquire that word and have it mean anything to us. And Vygotsky really showed that language is the mediator for our learning. He argued that through language, we are taking in new knowledge, and it becomes internalized into learning through taking what's around us in the form of speech and text, and becomes internalized as part of our own inner speech. And that's what learning is, essentially. Vygotsky is also very well known for this idea of the zone of proximal development, which is the idea that we learn best when we are in that space where we are receiving just information and skills just beyond what we can already do by ourselves, but not so difficult that we can't do them at all. So kind of the space of what we can do with help, which he called the zone of proximal development. Here's an image of that. And Vygotsky was very interested in learning and human development. Language was an important piece of that for him, but this is really a theory of learning. But many people who work in language education have also pointed to this theory as a way to make sense of how we can support language learners specifically. So here you see this image of the zone of proximal development, also called the ZPD, which is kind of the space between what a learner can already do on their own, what a learner cannot do yet, and what a learner can do with assistance. And that assistance can take many forms, and they're often called scaffolds. So there's different ways to scaffold language and learning, right? So that Zone of proximal development can be cultivated through modeling and think-alouds. So a teacher kind of showing how to do something through working with a peer or in a small group with peers who have different skills and abilities that others are still developing, through the use of graphic organizers to help make something more comprehensible, the use of visuals for that same purpose, sentence frames that help support learners in being able to produce language that they might not yet be able to produce yet, but with that assistance, they can. Deconstructing a text. So looking at different genres of writing, for example, different types of texts, and understanding the way that they're put together as a way to then support a student to begin to write those texts. So all of those are examples of scaffolding, or that getting into that space of the zone of proximal development. So much of the research now on first language acquisition has moved into this interactionist developmental perspective, beginning to kind of recenter the environment and its importance again, and the mediation with other people and other tools as a key part of language learning, although there still is an understanding that humans have some capacity for language acquisition that makes us different from other intelligent animals, other intelligent creatures. So there is something that is innate, it seems to be innate, that we're programmed to be able to do when it comes to language learning, but also to recognize the really vital role that interaction plays in helping us to acquire language. So I'm going to stop there for this video, and I'll pick it up in the next one.